You know, most musicians form a band, then they stay in the band until it's over. 20 years, 30 years, 50 years, and it starts to look sadly decrepit. It's like people hanging onto a life raft, or staying in a comfortable place. Those words are actually not my words. That is a quote from Robert Plant, something he said in an interview back in September of 2021. I'm Peter Scove and this is Music is a Journey, and today's topic is new albums by old bands. I've been buying a lot of recent releases by old bands over the last year or so. But as I've also shown on this channel, I'm always seeking out newer bands as well, or relatively newer bands. I started thinking a little while back about why it is those classic old bands feel the need to continue to churn out new material. No matter how good an album is by an old band, it will never sell like in the old days. First of all, the album market has been greatly affected by the internet and all of its trappings. Secondly, the time for old bands to build their audience of young music fans was long ago. Sure, they can gain a few new fans of younger generations, but it's not like in the 60s, 70s, or even in the 80s. Also, why do fans buy these new albums when most of their favorite albums by these classic bands are the old ones from the classic period? Is it out of loyalty? Is it an unwillingness to accept the music of new younger groups? Or is it a stubborn preference for the styles of those older groups? Many people still compare new releases by bands to their classic albums from 30, 40, or even 50 years ago. And of course, those albums were written by, or produced and recorded by, much younger bands who were very hungry for success at the time and had a completely different set of life experiences to what they have now after so many decades. And of course, back in those days when they were much younger, the whole music market had a whole different outlook. It offered them much more opportunities for stardom. So I checked out some quotes on the internet, just kind of randomly searching for things, what people had to say about this case of older bands releasing new albums. Here's some of the quotes I found. One comment on Let's Talk Music talked about old bands who have reformed and toured and are now making inconsequential music. The comment ended with a question. Should bands, or even members of a band, be allowed by fans to sully the original act's reputation with unnecessary new music? Wow! Okay, and then there was an article on the topic in the New York Times, and it had this to say about Tears for Fears. But while the life of what the industry calls a heritage act was enriching, it wasn't that engaging. So here I think we can understand that people who have spent a good portion of their lives writing, recording, and performing music, they are not content to just sit back and play the hits over and over again for, decades to come. They are artists, they are creators, and they really want to write something new and have something new to perform. And the article went on to express that exactly. The article said, anybody who does music professionally dreads going up and playing the one song people came to the show for. And of course now for these old bands who once sold millions of albums long ago, releasing a new album these days is just not really worth it, like as far as the payback goes. Continuing with that article from the Times, there was this. In purely business terms, it's hard for a veteran act to justify spending time and budget writing, recording, and releasing new songs when the money is in touring, merch, and getting your old hits in films, TV shows, commercials, or even TikToks. Part of the article also featured an interview with someone from the Doobie Brothers. So he had this to say. Going into an album now is nothing like it used to be. You don't get the payback you used to. So where it used to be you'd do an album and tour to support the album, now it's the other way around. I actually remember in the late 2000s somebody from Deep Purple saying a similar thing. It wasn't really worth their money, basically, to spend the time to make an album because they would end up losing on it. And actually, the truth is that during the first decade there of the 2000s, a lot of the old classic bands didn't release albums or only released one or two in that first whole decade. And this was largely due to the whole Napster debacle, where a lot of bands thought, well, if we release music and it's just going to be ripped off the internet and everybody gets it for free, what's the value to us then making new albums? And so during the years of about like 1999 up to 2009, 2010, there were bands that went for almost 10 years without releasing an album. And a couple of bands like Styx and Blue Oyster Cult went for over 15 years without releasing an album. Instead, they released albums of previously recorded live material, sometimes going back to their classic years, or they would just release live albums or live DVDs because it was just simply much cheaper to do that. I think one of the things I've found is that there is actual value in buying new albums by some of these older bands, and there are a few reasons for it. One of them is that a lot of these bands, they've already been through the growing pains of the post-classic years. You know, the bands who made it really big in the 70s, a lot of them really struggled in the 80s. And those that started out their careers having their success in the 80s had a really hard time in the 90s. There were changes in the styles of music they played, and they tried to adapt to do something different from what they were normally doing. And what happened was a lot of their old hardcore fans turned away from them. And then there were a lot of bands from the 80s who then really struggled in the 90s. So a lot of these bands now seem to be going back to their classic sound. They're going back to the period where the band was at their commercial and popular peak, and writing new albums on that, based on that kind of style. The good point is that as a fan of the band, you're pretty much going to get what you expect. The last 3 Deep Purple albums have been quite similar, and in fact, basically, the big change in Deep Purple was when Steve Morse joined the band, and he actually brought a lot of new, fresh ideas. When John Lord left, it was a little bit different. They had to find someone who was basically as close a fit as possible, and Don Airey came in, and he was probably one of the only people who could have taken over the job. With Steve Morse and Don Airey, Deep Purple continued to put out albums of fairly consistent quality, but I think the last 3 have really set the pace or the tone of the band. Similarly, Uriah Heep, after they got Bernie Shaw and Phil Lanzon on keyboards, Bernie Shaw on vocals there in the late 80s, the albums from Raging Silence and onward have basically kept the same style and sound. They've just released some albums that are better than others. So, with every album of Uriah Heep, you know basically what you're going to get. There's no surprise. And all those kind of odd experiments that went off in, a little bit wrong directions, they've all been tried and tested. They know where the failures are, they know where the strengths are, and they play to their strengths. Of course, what that means is that the older albums had more variety. It was like if you bought, for example, a Uriah Heep album in the 1970s, the selection of songs was a little bit like a soup du jour at a restaurant, where every day you go in and it's a different soup. Just like listening to the album, every track is a different, distinguishable track. These days, a lot of these classic bands, it's more like a soup de semaine, where basically there is one flavor of soup throughout the whole album, and just, one day will have more corn than another day, and another day will have a little extra cheese on it or something. Some of the albums are like that, and while they can be a pleasant listening experience from beginning to end, at the end of the album you think, what were the standout tracks anyway? And actually, I'm going to mention this a little bit later on when we talk about Uriah Heep, so I'll wait till that moment. Of course, through a lot of member changes, and even, especially with vocalists, over decades of aging and using their voices, the bands don't sound exactly like they do in their classic period. But another thing is, of course, the recording techniques. In the 1970s, there was a lot of in-studio innovation, whereas these days things can be pretty much smoothed out to impeccable perfection. On the one hand, I actually like the sound of the 70s where things were still, frontier type work, where they were basically trying new things out and seeing what worked and that kind of thing, experimenting in the studio. But on the other hand, a lot of these recent recordings that I've been picking up, the sound quality is just so good. Like the guitars sound like they are there in the room with you. You can hear every bit of percussion on the drum sets. You can hear the bass, pick out the vocals, the different keyboards that are in there. Everything just sounds really good. You don't get, like, for example, in the 80s, these bright, polished, echoey 80s sounds, or in the 70s sometimes the drums weren't really mixed very strongly, and you don't have those kind of problems with most of the new releases. Bands have been in the studio for 15, 20 albums or even more, and these days they know what to do to get what they want, and they work with the producers that help bring out that sound and that quality of the band they're looking for. Of course, one complaint that I've heard about people reviewing a lot of new albums is the length. You know, back in the day, when albums were made for vinyl, you would get albums basically 35 to 40 minutes long, sometimes a little bit longer. And that was kind of the precedent. Like from the 60s onwards, that's what you heard from an album. And these days, you've got a CD which can take up to just about 80 minutes. And so a lot of bands are coming out with like over 60 minutes of music, or even over 50 minutes. And what a lot of reviewers are saying, and what I'm kind of finding myself, is that sometimes an album can just feel a little bit too long. It's like you've got 13 tracks and maybe 7 of them are really great, and then there are a couple of ones that are quite good. Of course, there's 1 or 2 that are totally fabulous, but then you'll end up with about 4 or 5 other tracks that are like, it's all right. Nothing special about that there. So, you know, would it be different like in the past where a band would put out basically an album a year? Rarely did it go more than 15 months between albums, and sometimes only a few months between albums. But you would get an album with a fresh bunch of material that had a particular sound to it, a particular approach, particular style, whatever, based on, like, you know, how it was recorded and who produced it and what the band was just doing at the time, what they were using to get the sound for their instruments, what pedals, what effects, and all that kind of thing. And an album of 7, 8, 9, 10 songs would be all that you got from that moment in the band's career. And you loved it, you hated it, whatever, but that's what that was. And then when the next album came out, some months or a year or so later, there was already something different happening. Whereas these days you've got bands, takes them years to put out an album, and then you get like 13 songs that are all basically the same quality, same sound, and very similar in style. So actually, I watched a video by Michael Nolan, who I think is a bass player. He has a YouTube channel, and he was talking about the new Yes album, Mirror the Sky, which is due out just next month, I think, in May of 2023. And he addressed this issue of album length, and this is what he had to say. I've said it's time bands start embracing the technology they've been using. A prog rock band is the perfect kind of band to put out longer albums, because that's what you can do with CDs these days. To me, the CD has never ever been properly utilized as a media. Instead, we get most bands, there's a few bands that have broken with that, but most bands put out about 40, 45-minute album, a mentality that comes from the 60s when you couldn't get more than 22 minutes aside. So what do you think? Do you like albums that are a little bit longer, like about an hour of music, or, 13, 14 tracks? Or would you prefer the albums to be a little bit shorter? I think one solution is to put out, say, like 8 to 10 tracks and say, this is the album. And then we've got some bonus tracks to tack on there that were also recorded during the time, but we feel don't actually fit into the album itself. And there are actually some albums I'm going to mention that cover that. Okay, so now let me share my opinions of some of these new releases by older bands that I've picked up recently. So first up, this is Blue Oyster Cult, The Symbol Remains, an album which was released on October 9th, 2020, and is the band's 15th album. The lineup features Eric Bloom on guitars and vocals, and Buck Dharma on lead guitars and vocals. These are the 2 members that go back to the very first album, and the only 2 members who have played on every album. Keyboard player Alan Lanier sadly passed away back in 2013. He had been on all but one album until then. So this is the second album in the Blue Oyster Cult catalog that doesn't feature Alan Lanier. Also, Sandy Pearlman, who was involved with the band throughout most of their career, either as a manager or as a producer. They were going to consult him about the idea of making this new album, but then he also passed away in 2016. Other two members, the Bouchard brothers, they're off doing their own thing, sometimes performing Blue Oyster Cult songs that they wrote. But basically, you know, Blue Oyster Cult in the 70s had 5 songwriters, and now we're down to 2 songwriters. And also we had 4 lead vocalists, with one person taking lead vocals, I think, twice. So now basically each song just trades back and forth between Eric Bloom lead vocals or Buck Dharma's lead vocals. My opinion of this album was that it is really an awesome album. Right from the get-go, with tracks like That Was Me, Box in My Head, Tainted Blood, we're off to a really great start. Eric Bloom has the more sinister side, whereas Buck Dharma has the more melodic side, and there's a really beautiful contrast between the two, and also just it sounds like Blue Oyster Cult. This album is a little less experimental, like you don't get as much variety of styles as you did especially in the 1970s, but it does stick to basically an either melodic rock or heavy rock format, which I think works really fine. It is a total of, 14 tracks on here? So I found when I was listening to it, the beginning part, I thought, wow, it's just great song after great song. And then somewhere after that, my mind kind of wandered a bit, and I thought, you know what, it's just like a bunch of, older dudes playing rock. But then after that, the album continued with a number of other great songs. And one of them on here, The Alchemist, that is just like tops. And I was really glad when I read reviews of this album to find that almost everybody was mentioning The Alchemist as the track to pick from the album. Fantastic heavy song featuring some pretty dynamic piano near the end, and a story about a sorcerer who's unfairly murdered by a king who thinks that, his prince is gone and the sorcerer is to blame, but actually the prince is still alive. And then the sorcerer's son, the alchemist, basically curses the king's line so that none of the young kings in that line will ever reach to a certain age. They just all die. It's a really cool song. And yeah, overall, listening to this album again just this past week, I'd say most of the tracks here are pretty exciting and pretty cool stuff. So if it were up to me to release this as a 10-track album, I think it would probably turn out to be a total 5-star ripper of an album. As it is, it's a 5-star album with a few extra tracks on that are kind of okay. Alright, Blue Oyster Cult. Alright, I'm going to admit right now that I am not a tremendous Wishbone Ash fan. It's not that I don't like them. I have their classic album Argus, I also have the debut, and I like those 2 albums just fine. But I never really got into the band. Now, a couple of months ago, I started thinking about them, and so I went to the Sea of Tranquility YouTube channel to hear what Pete Pardo had to say about Wishbone Ash's discography, because I knew Pete Pardo would be able to speak about just about every album. So, I made a note of the albums that he liked, and I went and checked them out, and the ones from the 70s I thought, not quite. It's a little bit more gentle rock, a little bit more southern rock, and I wasn't really so keen on what I heard. But Pete Pardo had great things to say about some of the later albums, especially this one here, Coat of Arms. This is Wishbone Ash's 23rd album, released on February 28th, 2020. The only member from the original lineup that remains is Andy Powell, guitars and vocals, and he has been with the band on all 23 albums. I am super impressed with this album. This is one where by the time it's over, I am just ready to play it again. I'd say more than half, maybe 75% of the songs on here, even listening to it for the 3rd time, 4th time, 5th time, I still keep thinking, wow, what a cool song for most of them. It's got a good rock sound. It's not even hard rock. It is a rock sound, like those guitars, electric guitars with a bit of overdrive. There are occasionally some parts that also have some distortion, but it is not like hard rock or metal distortion, of course. Wishbone Ash do have a kind of southern rock sound to their style, which I am not totally keen on usually, but for me it works on this album here. I actually really enjoy it. Yeah, most of the tracks on here, they're just great. Also, Wishbone Ash in the past, around the Argus area, they were kind of put in the progressive rock category. I don't think of them normally as a progressive rock band, from what I've heard. Most of the songs maybe no. But this album goes back to that classic period where they did stretch over and put in some riffs with some odd time signatures and songs that go through some unexpected changes. So I just have nothing but great things to say about this album. I probably should have done a review video on just this. But yeah, very cool, Wishbone Ash. If all of their albums thrilled me as much as this one, I'd be in trouble because I'd find myself having to shell out cash for another 20 albums here, which I can't do right now. Alright, next up, this is Heaven and Earth by Yes. This was their 21st album, which was released back in July 16th of 2014. This is the final album to feature Chris Squire on bass, and vocals, and also the second last Yes album, second or third album to feature Alan White on drums, who Alan White of course just passed away last year. We have John Davison on vocals. John Davison has a very similar style to John Anderson, of course the original Yes vocalist. I think John Davison probably is greatly inspired by John Anderson, but I do find that John Davison has more ability to hit the notes more smoothly and also transition between notes more smoothly. John Anderson, even during the classic years, was a little bit shaky on the notes sometimes in the transitions. We also have, of course, Steve Howe on guitar, Jeff Downes on keyboards. So it is the, Fly From Here and Drama lineup, just with a different vocalist than they had on those two albums. When this album came out, I was really excited because I had only just really gotten into Yes like 2 or 3 years earlier. So this was a new album. When I got into Yes, Fly From Here had just been released. And so I was really excited to hear this one. And quite honestly, even though I tried to give it my best opinion, it honestly has not thrilled me so much. It is a pretty calm album. You know, if you think of Yes as being a symphonic prog band that in their classic days went out and explored the landscape of progressive rock, on this album here I feel it's more like you are drifting through the clouds over the landscape of progressive rock, and occasionally there is a mountain that juts out through the clouds and you think, oh, that's going to be exciting, and then you just kind of drift on past, and it's not really until the last track where you come down for a bit of a landing again. Now after this album, they went ahead and they did Fly From Here Return Flight. For some reason they felt they had to redo the album. Chris Squire is not on the redo. As far as I know, unless they used his old recordings. John Davison now takes over the lead vocals. Not really sure what that was all about. And then more recently, when was it? Back in 2021, they released The Quest. And I remember some people I knew were really excited about The Quest. However, reading reviews about it now, most people are giving it around 3 stars, saying it starts out rather exciting, but after that it becomes a rather languid affair. So with this new album, Mirror the Sky, coming out in May next month, already the reviews I'm hearing make it sound like it's going to be really exciting. But, you know, I'm kind of worried that the pre-release tracks are the ones that are going to whet your appetite and make you want to get the album, and the rest of it might not be as exciting. You know, it's kind of like when you buy a bag of, say, like a bag of granola with dried strawberries in, and you open it up and you see those dried strawberry flakes in there, and there are so many of them, and the first 2 bowls of cereal you pour, you get lots of dried strawberry flakes, but after that, you know, the rest of it is kind of just granola. That's what I'm kind of worried about the next Yes album will sound like. But I haven't had anything since Heaven and Earth, so I'm kind of curious. I'll probably get it, and, you know, let's hope for the best. As it so happened, I put all of the albums I'm talking about today on a playlist, and I just did it kind of randomly. And after the Yes album finished, this other progressive rock styled album started, and man was it ever exciting. It was lively. If we're talking about, yes, it having you floating through the clouds over the progressive rock landscape, this album here had me feel like I was running through the landscape with this big grin on my face. It had power and excitement. There was stuff happening in the music. Some tracks were kind of dark and moody. Some tracks were very beautiful. And some tracks just, had so much going on. It was an album of such variety, and amazingly, this is also an album of 15 tracks, but they are all pretty short. Basically going somewhere, maybe none over 5 minutes, and then some of them even just under like a minute, or a couple of minutes. And I'm talking about Crash of the Crown, which is Styx's 17th album released on June 28th, 2021. This was their second album in recent years, the other one being The Mission from 2017. Otherwise, they had not released an album of original material since 2003. They did do a 2005 album, The Big Bang Theory, but that was all cover songs. Now, Styx, they have 3 lead vocalists. Although James Young, who is one of the original members remaining with the band, does not take any lead vocals here, which is the second time he's never actually written anything for an album, the other time being the cover songs album. But you have got Tommy Shaw, who joined the band back in '75, doing lead vocals. Excellent job. And you've got Lawrence Gowan, who took over in the band after they basically kicked Dennis DeYoung out. Now, Dennis DeYoung was, of course, the kind of original creative force of Styx. He was the one who basically decided what the band was doing and which way they were going. And that actually bothered a lot of people, particularly Tommy Shaw, who is also a kind of leader type person, I think. So when Dennis DeYoung was kicked out of the band, a lot of people just thought, that's it. Dennis was Styx for me, and if he's not in the band, I don't care. But I have to say that I've been enjoying the albums that Styx did after Dennis DeYoung left, and this one here is just a killer, and the previous one, The Mission, was also really good. So I am kind of keeping an eye on the internet now. Are Styx going to do another new album? Doesn't say now, but I hope they get around to it. This one was really awesome. I should also say that this album also has Chuck Panazzo as one of the founding members playing bass, but only on 2 tracks. Chuck has been battling AIDS for the last couple of decades now. Of course, he's got medication and he's living with it. So he basically appears on the band's albums, doing a couple of tracks, and he appears in live performances occasionally. But yeah, so you've got Chuck Panazzo as a founding member, and you've got James Young, who was the last person to join the original lineup back in the early 70s. Deep Purple's most recent release of original studio material is Whoosh, their 21st album from August 7th, 2020. They did release an album a year or so after, which was all cover tunes. But this is the most recent original album. They basically went through a bit of a gap for a while without releasing anything, and there was that time there where they were thinking maybe it wasn't really worth it to do a new album. But then back in, I think it was 2011 or 12, they did Now What?, hooking up with Bob Ezrin as their producer, and later on after that they did, was it Infinite? And then Whoosh came after that. And these last 3 albums have been really quite good. I especially enjoyed Now What?, which was an album that I felt not only had their up-to-date modern sound, but made a lot of kind of musical references back to the early days, even back to the original Mark I lineup. There were moments that reminded me of those early albums on the Tetragrammaton label. The second album, Infinite, I felt lacked a lot of those kind of special points that Now What? Did, but Whoosh kind of brings some of them back a little bit. I don't like it as much as Now What?, but I like it better than Infinite. The thing that I noticed is, especially on this album, and maybe also Infinite, is that I don't notice Steve Morse playing on these albums as much. Yes, he does. I do hear his guitar solos in here from time to time, but I feel it's Don Airey who is actually taking over much more, doing some of the more interesting types of keyboard solos that kind of unique to Deep Purple, or this kind of a band anyway. Not your traditional pop band keyboard solos, of course. Now, as I've heard, Steve Morse's wife is battling cancer, and so he has taken his leave of the band. And they brought in Simon McBride from a band called Sweet Savage, which I actually am not familiar with. He has now taken over for Steve Morse in the band, and they are talking about working on a new album this year. So the big question will be, will Steve Savage bring something new to the band, as Steve Morse did, or as Tommy Bolin did way back then? Or is he basically going to try to fill Steve Morse's shoes? We'll find out. So next up, we have Living the Dream. This is Uriah Heep's 24th album, released September 14th, 2018. And until recently, this was their most recent album. But a couple of months back, they released Chaos in Color, their 25th. Mick Box, guitarist Mick Box, is the only member, founding member of the band still with them, and actually the only surviving member from the classic lineup, with Lee Kerslake and Ken Hensley passing away in the fall of 2020, I think it was. And of course, David Byron passed away a couple of decades back in the 80s, and Gary Thane, bass player Gary Thane, on those classic years, he passed away back in the mid-70s. So Mick Box, the last one left standing. Of course, we've got Bernie Shaw on vocals and Phil Lanzon on keyboards. They've been with the band since around 1986, 87, around that time there. And they've basically, the three of them have kept the same, three of them have been with the same lineup there ever since then. And of course, with the beginning of Raging Silence, beginning with Raging Silence and carrying on up to this one here, the band has released 9 albums with those 3 members. And of course, bass and drums, we've seen some changes there. A lot of the albums with Bernie Shaw and Phil Lanzon, I find some of them are kind of okay, but with some pretty cool songs, and other ones are actually pretty good. Some of the more recent ones, I thought they have kind of been more consistent with their sound. That is to say that they're basically doing the same style album after album without any kind of, adventurous variety going on. As I talked about earlier, it's like the soup du jour type of thing. However, I will say that this album here does stand out for me because I feel that Phil Lanzon is getting a little bit more forward feature with the Hammond organ. And honestly, there are moments on here when I was still not quite so familiar with this album and still hadn't really gotten into Deep Purple's Whoosh album. When I had these on a mixed playlist and songs randomly came up when I had it on shuffle, there were moments when I thought, oh, it's another Deep Purple song, and then Bernie Shaw started singing. And there have also been some times where I'm just listening to how Phil Lanzon uses the organ in some songs, and I think, man, that is really Don Airy. Wow. So that's really cool. You could almost like swap Bernie Shaw and Ian Gillan on these 2 albums, and it would work. Now, a couple of years back, I saw a review of this album by Sarah Kitteringham and Martin Popoff for the Headbanger TV YouTube channel. Sarah being a much younger person, I think she's in her early 30s now, and Martin Popoff being a few years older than me. Both of them fans of the band. And they both gave very favorable reviews for this. But one thing that Sarah pointed out, which I kind of have to agree with a lot of Uriah Heep's more recent albums, I'd say, like, since the late 80s anyway, is that there is not so much variety. So even when you're listening to it and you think, wow, this album sounds really cool, by the end of it, you don't really remember which song exactly was what. You have to listen to it a few times before you start to notice, this one had that really cool synthesizer solo, or this one had that kind of breakdown in the middle where there was that bass and guitar part and the Hammond organ came in. But it is still really good, and as I'm getting more familiar with it, more of the tracks are starting to stand out for me. I think the 2 that I really notice now anyway, the title track, Living the Dream, of course, and then Rocks in the Road are the 2 tracks that stand out for me so far. But there you go, Uriah Heep, one of those old bands who have found that by sticking to one comfortable style, they can continue to put out new material every few years. All right. I was a huge Nazareth fan during the mid-80s. I had all of the albums from the debut up to Cinema on cassette, and then after that I kind of lost interest in them. So I didn't buy any Nazareth albums after that. Although several years ago I picked up a box set of a lot of their singles and B-sides, I think mostly singles anyway, which included some songs from a couple of the later albums after Cinema. However, Pete Pardo on Sea of Tranquility did a review, ranking the albums of Nazareth, and he had some pretty favorable comments to say about Big Dogs, which was their 22nd album, released on April 15th, 2011. Now this album here, since then they've released an album called Rock and Roll Telephone with the same lineup in 2014. And then after that, Tattooed on My Brain, which has Carl Sentence on vocals. And then in 2022, Surviving the Law. Now the lineup on this album here is original vocalist Dan McCafferty. But Dan, of course, he left the band after the album after this and released some solo work, and Dan just passed away, was it last year, I think? And as well, original guitarist Manny Charlton also passed away last year, but he had left the band back around 1990. So of this, the original members, Dan McCafferty on vocals, Pete Agnew on bass. Original drummer Daryl Sweet passed away a couple of decades back. Pete Agnew's son, Lee Agnew, has been playing drums for the band since then, so kind of close. And then on guitars we have Jimmy Murrison, who, as far as I know, is still playing guitars with the band. However, that means the last two albums by Nazareth only feature one original member. But that's how it is with a lot of these bands. My opinion of this album is that it is really good. It has a lot of the things you would expect from a classic Nazareth album. You've got the hard-rocking songs. You've got the songs with a bit of a twist of humor in. You've got the kind of slower, more meaningful songs. You've got the little bit more what the socially observant songs. There's one here that keeps making references to like when Jesus comes for the second time, whatever, you and your friends will have the last laugh or something like that. The sound on the album is great. I mean, all these albums I'm talking about here, the production is really great. I love the sound on this one. And overall, yeah, I do like this album. Am I going to run out and grab the other more recent Nazareth albums? Probably not. But, you know, it's really nice to hear some material that's new to me featuring Dan McCafferty and the Nazareth sound. Released February 22nd in 2022, the 19th album by Scorpions, Rock Believer. This features Rudolf Schenker, who is of course the founding member going way back to 1966, and original vocalist Klaus Meine, who joined the band around 1970 and has been the vocalist on all of their albums. Matthias Jabs on guitar, who joined the band around 1979 for the Love Drive album, and has been with the band throughout all of their albums since then. And then other two new guys, because Scorpions keep changing their drummers and bass players a fair bit. Anyway, Rock Believer. This album is a classic sounding Scorpions album. If you go back to Love Drive, Animal Magnetism, and Blackout, it's like that's the type of album they wanted to make. The Scorpions in the latter half of the 90s and even in the 2000s were kind of wavering between trying something new, which a lot of people didn't like, and trying to get back to their traditional classic sound, which people were certainly hoping to hear more of. This album here just really goes for that Love Drive to Blackout sound. There are even a lot of references to their classic period, like the opening track, Gas in the Tank, says black me in and black me out as a reference to Blackout. There's a song on here called Seventh Son, which is quite similar to China White from the Blackout album. There's another song on here which, I forget the song and I forget which one it reminds me of, but it's got this, you know, very similar sound to something from the Love Drive album. There are some other lyrical references to other songs. There's even the title track, Rock Believer. Scream for me, Screamer, I'm a rock believer. That takes us back to Steam Rock Fever from the Taken by Force album in 1977, where the chorus went Steam Rock Fever, Screaming Rock Believer. So, overall, I haven't bought a Scorpions album since love it for Sting? No, I bought Savage Amusement on cassette in the 80s and I never bothered to get it on CD. So this was my first Scorpions purchase since then, and I think it's a really great album. Klaus Mein's vocals are wonderful. He still is a great singer, and the songs are, yeah, what you'd expect if you grew up with the Scorpions as they were in the 1980s. The only thing is that it is like there's so many references to those classic days that you almost feel like, did they really not have that many new good ideas, or are they purposely doing it, you know, for old guys like me? Judas Priest were one of the first bands that I ever really got into. My first band was AC/DC and the next one was Judas Priest. So I tend to try not to miss albums, although I did miss, I guess it was after Turbo Lover, I stepped off the Judas Priest train for a long time, but finally got back in around Angel of Retribution and continued from there, although I have missed some in between as well. This one, Firepower, was released, it's March 9th, 2018. It's the band's 18th album. I was reading a lot of good things about it and I thought, all right, let me check it out. And you know what? I actually really like it. Screaming for Vengeance is still my favorite, but this is better than some of the albums from the 80s, like Ram It Down, Turbo Lover. Didn't really care so much for them. So I find this is a very kind of welcome back to the Judas Priest sound. We've got Rob Halford on vocals. He joined shortly before they recorded their first album. Glenn Tipton on guitars, who also joined after Rob Halford, but again just before recording the debut album back in 1974. I think Rob Halford joined in 73. You've got Ian Hill on bass. We do not have KK Downing, who was one of the original guitarists. He left the band in 2011. We've got Scott Travis on drums, who joined the band around 89, 1980, or at least, you know, has been on all albums since the Painkiller album. Yeah, basically very nice, and now I understand that Judas Priest are working on another new album to come out perhaps next year. So I'm going to be looking forward to that. I think they did a good job on this one. I made a separate video about this here. This is Anvil's Impact is Imminent, which was their 19th album released last year, May 20th, 2020, featuring Steve Lips Kudlow on vocals and guitar and Rob Reiner on drums. And these two are Anvil, basically. They have been together since the beginning and on every Anvil album. The only thing that changes basically is if they have another guitarist on, or if they have who they have on bass, basically. And Anvil is, as some people say, a one-trick pony. They basically make the same style album for all 19 albums. They are a traditional heavy metal band with some speed metal as well. And remember, the thing that set Anvil apart back in the early 80s was that they were one of the first bands to really start pushing the speed metal envelope, and inspired a lot of the thrash bands who came along shortly after that. How does it sound? The album sounds really cool. What are the songs like? Quite typical of Anvil. But as I said in the other video, a lot of the reviewers that I read at the time, just last year anyway, were saying that even though Anvil produced basically the same album again and again, some albums do stand out more than others, and this one stands out above some of their more recent releases. So anyway, pretty darn good. Couple more to go. This is Synchro Anarchy from Voivod. It is their most recent release, going back to February 11th last year, 2022. It is their 15th album. We've got Snake on vocals and Away on drums, who are two of the founding members of the band. Dennis DeMoore, Piggy, the guitarist, passed away in 2005, and the band was basically considering themselves done for, but they were given a lot of opportunities to appear at some shows and festivals, and so they brought in Chewy, Daniel Monran, on guitars, and Chewy had been a Voivod fan way back since Killing Technology, and that was the album that inspired him to start playing the guitar as well. Original bassist Blackie, he was away from the band for a long time. He joined again, but he got kind of tired of the bullshit of the way the band was being run at the time and thought, I don't need to be a part of this. And so they brought in another fellow whose name is Rocky for the stage name in Voivod. And I think with Chewie and Rocky, I mean, Rocky also was inspired to take up his instrument because of Voivod's killing technology. So with two of the original members out, the two replacements basically are the best you could possibly get, because both of them really know what it is to play guitar or play bass in Voivod. You have this album and the previous one, The Wake, from 2018, for which they won a Juno Award in Canada. That is the top music award. You've got two really terrific albums that follow the traditional 80s Voivod sound from Killing Technology, Dimension Hatros, and Nothing Face, but you've got all fresh new material. Yeah, the opening track, you know, after it starts off, I almost hear like it's like the beginning of Forgotten in Space. I'm waiting for Snake to say, "All systems go!" But actually, no. It's fresh material and a lot of exciting music, and you know, Voivod have such an unusual way of writing riffs and music, and they do it so well on this album and the previous one. So congratulations to Voivod for still putting out albums that are exciting and fresh, not just, you know, going back to the old days for the sake of it, but actually working great new material with it. Okay. So the last album I want to talk about is The Book of Souls, Iron Maiden. It came out September 4th, 2015. This was their 16th release. Of course, since then they've put out Senjitsu, which I honestly haven't heard. I was really excited about this when it came out because I had not bought an Iron Maiden album, a new release, since Seventh Son of a Seventh Son. And so I was really kind of curious. I thought, hey, this is kind of a chance for me to get back into Iron Maiden. And I was very impressed with this. There are a lot of longer songs, giving the band a chance to stretch out more, put in more instrumental parts, which was one of the things I always liked about them back in the 80s. You know, right from songs like Phantom of the Opera, where we'd have this like massive instrumental section in there. We're going through different changes in the rhythm and in the time signatures and so on. Also, a lot of their albums have been doing that. And so after hearing this, and especially, you know, Empire of the Clouds, that's a fantastic song, 18 minutes long, great lyrical, historical type, lyrically historical story. You've got like, you know, piano in there, you've even got some strings, you know, you've got the band really showing what they can do. And I went back and picked up all the albums with this lineup here. The lineup, by the way, of course, is Steve Harris, founding member, going back to 1976, was it 76? Dave Murray, who joined the band shortly after that and is probably the second oldest member of the band, Dave Murray on guitar. Then, of course, we got Adrian Smith joining for the Killers album in 81, Bruce Dickinson joining for Number of the Beast in 82, and Nico McBrain joining for Peace of Mind in 1983. And then after Adrian Smith left, Janet Gears came in on guitar, and then when Adrian Smith came back, they decided to keep Yannick in the band, and so now they've been going with 3 guitarists since then. So yeah, being so impressed with this, I went back and picked up the other 4 albums prior to this one here, right from Brave New World and onwards. All of them having some very good tracks. But the one thing that I find is that Iron Maiden in those albums and that stable lineup of 6 there are basically producing these Iron Maidenisms albums. Like, just every album sounds like a very typical Iron Maiden album. Like, they've got, you know, the longer tracks with the, you know, the little more developed instrumental sections. They've got the kind of, you know, dun 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 dun. You know, they do a lot of kind of riffs like that. They have those clean electric guitar songs, and I always feel, you know, after hearing so many of them, I feel like, I don't know the musical term, but let's say, for example, that they always compose those songs in Lydian mode. And I just feel like every time they do that, they're using Lydian mode, or, you know, for example, E minor scale or something. It always has similar kind of pace, similar picking style, similar sound. So basically, listening to this album again now, I feel that what they did was to just kind of pull out a lot of the things they've already done on the albums throughout their catalog and just put them all together into new songs. Is it a bad album, though? No, it's quite exciting. And actually, I remember one reviewer or one critic saying about the album that a lot of the songs were really good, but they get bogged down by the prog jam, log jam sections, which I thought was funny because those are the parts that I like. So yeah, how is Senjutsu? I don't know, and I'm not sure if I'm going to listen to it or not, but anyway, pretty cool to get this one here. Alright, I knew that was going to be a long video getting into it, but those are my thoughts about old bands releasing new albums, and those are my thoughts about the new albums that I have picked up. I do think it's a good thing. I'm really glad to know that these people who are now in their 60s or even 70s still have that creative energy to go out and make new albums and produce great new songs. Some of these albums are much more impactful on me than others, but I'm very glad to know that they're still doing that. And as far as I'm concerned, you know, a lot of these bands, I was really thrilled about their classic period, so I know they can write great songs and make great albums. So that's the reason why I keep wanting to check out what they're doing, or suddenly feel, hey, I've got to go back and see what this band has been doing the last few years. Because I know there are going to be really cool songs on there. They are talented, experienced musicians who know how to do what they do best. Okay, that's enough for this video. Thank you all for watching. See you again in another video. Please do leave your comments below if you have anything to say. Tell me what are some of your favorite old bands who have released new albums. What are those albums? What do you think about them? Alright, and we'll see you in the next video then. Until then, bye.